Let's have a look at one of the ideas for excellence, which is to look at some assumptions underlying our model. So, in one of the previous videos for merit, I talked about one of the assumptions you always make is about independence. Now, what we need to do is we need to think about other assumptions that we would make. So here are a couple of ideas that are quite common assumptions to make. So one of the things is about the probability of each outcome being constant throughout the whole simulation. So for example, if I was talking about the different eye colour, then I would expect for child number 1 that the probability that they get blue, grey, brown or green eyes, I expect that those probabilities are exactly the same as for child number 2. And I expect the probabilities for child number 3 to be the same. So I'm expecting that each child has the same probability. Okay, so that's something that is quite common to assume, that the probabilities are going to be constant every time. Another assumption is that we could think about is that when we generate random numbers on the computer, on the calculator, we assume that those are truly random numbers. Okay, and there's a whole field of mathematics that goes into random numbers. What we're going to do is we're assuming that what the formulas that we're using are going to give us true random numbers. Okay. A third idea is thinking about our data being representative, but that's not a great one. I don't want to see that one come up too often. Okay. The other things that we want to think about is what happens in real life and where does real life differ from my model. So I want to compare that real life to the mathematical model that we've got and think about some of the differences between them. So let's have a look at an example here. So we've got our different eye colours. So one assumption is what I just talked about before, is that I assume that each eye colour, that the probability of each eye colour is constant for every child. Okay, and then I need to have a little comment on it. Is this a reasonable assumption to make? What do I think of it? Not just here's the assumption, but let's comment on it and discuss it. Okay, so I'm saying here I think that assumption will be quite reasonable because each child is getting a mixture of genetics. So they're getting half of their genetics from their mum, half from their dad. So each child, as long as both the parents are the same, each child's probability should be pretty similar each time. Okay, if we were talking about a child that had a different father, then obviously that scenario wouldn't be valid. Okay. Another assumption that we can make, I'm going to jump down to the third one here, is looking at those eye colours remaining independent. That might not hold true if you've got, for example, identical twins. So if you've got identical twins, then the way that process works is that often these two children will be identical in most aspects. And so that means that their eye colour may not be independent. Okay, so this is kind of thinking about the real life and comparing it to the reality. So another assumption here that I've talked about is we're assuming that, for example, the food that the mother eats during each pregnancy is going to be similar. And I'm assuming that whatever you eat doesn't have an effect on the eye colour of the child. There's lots of things we don't know about science yet, and so that might be something that I need to assume. Okay, and I think that's quite a good assumption. I think that's a reasonable thing to assume, that the food you eat doesn't change your eye colour, but I can't say for sure. So that's why it's an assumption, because we don't know absolutely. Once we've gone and looked at those assumptions and discussed them, we want to think about the effect of those assumptions, okay? So if one of those assumptions wasn't true, how is that going to affect our results? And what I want you to think about is the analogy, is if I'm building a house, okay? And if I build the house on a nice, strong concrete pad, okay, really solid concrete pad, it's a really good foundation, and so the house is not likely to move very much in storms, okay, versus a house that I build which is built on water, for example, okay, pretty shaky foundations. As soon as the foundations are shaky, the house is going to start collapsing down, falling apart, cracks in the walls, all the rest of it. And this is like what happens with our model. If our assumptions are pretty solid, then the model that we've built on top of it will be pretty solid. If the assumptions that our house is built on are pretty weak, then our house or our model is not going to be very good. Okay, and this is why we need to look into what some of the assumptions might be. And so I want you to think about how explaining that in context for your simulation that you do.